The ridge towered above the jungle, above the wind-torn sea, like the backbone of a giant whale. From here there was a fine view not only of the bay, but also of the northern part of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Ivy pushed us along, striding ahead of us like a soccer team coach, leading his charges onto the field. He led us to the southern end of the ridge where it curved up into the jungle. We were assigned an extra machine gun, and the lieutenant divided our squad into two parts. Chuckles takes one, Lucky takes the other. His voice was clearly troubled, and we felt the seriousness of the moment. Look, he said, pointing toward the jungle. That's Grassy Knoll. Someone had taken the opportunity to sarcasm. Oh, great, even if we never get there, we can always say we saw it. Lieutenant bit his lip and continued. According to intelligence, the Japanese are gathering there. Today they can be expected here. After these words, he no longer had the need to demand the attention of the audience. They are being held back by other units, but there is no guarantee that they will not come here again. That is why you have been allocated another machine gun. He turned and looked down at the jungle. The road to Grassy Knoll runs through here. Everyone was silent, and he waved to me and my boys, inviting me to follow him. We jumped down from a small ledge. The lieutenant indicated a sort of low cave in the hillside. Set up your machine gun there, he said, and departed, promising to send a hot meal closer to nightfall. It was a trap. It was a trap, a trap, a trap. It was the blind eye, the eye of evil, the empty eye socket on the Cyclops' forehead, staring down from the red clay hillside into the deep gorge from which night was creeping up on us. We looked at each other in silence. All right, I shrugged. Let's get the machine gun up there. Just as silently we set it up. But there was room for only two men besides him, me and my assistant, Cincinnati, a stocky blonde from Ohio who had distinguished himself in Australia by lending money to his comrades at 10% interest. The rest of us, the runner, the stump, the orderly Red, and Amish, the Pennsylvanian Dutchman, had set up on the hillside. I could hear them walking around, gradually moving farther and farther away from the trap. I didn't say anything, and who could blame them? I felt as if my hands were tied. It was impossible to fight from this position. We'd be wiped out before we could see the enemy. A group of little yellow-skinned men would come within a few meters and attack us. If we managed to fight back, then they just don't know how to fight. Our cave was so poorly camouflaged and so poorly located that we could be killed with a single-hand grenade on the first try. They wouldn't even have to aim. If the Japanese come today, we'll probably die in this postage stamp-sized firing point. We can't get out of here, and there's nowhere to go. But even worse, we can't stop them anyway. It's no use trying to hold them off. It's one thing to die. It's quite another to die uselessly. Night fell. We sat in complete darkness and silence, listening to our own breathing, shuddering at the sound of earth crumbling down the slope. Far below, the jungle lived its life. We began to swear. Quietly, very quietly, so that, God forbid, no one would hear. We swore at the impenetrable stupidity of the officer who chose the positions, Lieutenant Ivy's lack of consideration, and many other things. We asked for all sorts of things individually and in pairs, generally and specifically. When this activity became boring, however, it appeared that the feeling of helplessness had gone somewhere. I said to Cincinnati, "Start taking the machine gun apart. Let's get out of here. Let's move it up the hill. I don't know about you, but I don't plan on dying without a fight." "Say that again," he whispered, and immediately got to work. I crawled out of the cave to warn the boys. "Runner Amish," I called softly. "Is that you, Lucky?" There was surprise in Amish's voice, with a touch of suspicion. "Yes, it is. Listen, we're going upstairs with the machine gun. There's a trap down there. Cover us while we move, and warn Hotun and the others so we don't get shot." "Okay," he whispered, and I went back into the cave. "Take the machine gun and the water canister," I said to Cincinnati, "and I'll take the tripod and the box of ammunition." Without waiting for an answer, I said quietly. We were laden with so heavy a load that we didn't even try to crawl. We simply tossed aside the sandbags that covered the cave entrance and climbed out of a mousetrap that could not protect us, but was quite claustrophobic. Setting up the machine gun a second time, we were tired and sweaty, but relieved. Now we had a fighting chance. But the nervous tension wouldn't let go. Not 10 minutes later, I touched Cincinnati's arm. I felt a movement down on my left side. And I heard the command. All hands to me. There was no doubt. The enemy was near. We waited tensely for the appearance of little yellow-skinned men, silhouettes of mushrooms with helmeted caps against the dark background of the jungle. But there was no one. No one ever showed up throughout the night, though we heard rifle shots and the sound of mortar fire. In the morning we learned that the army units had been attacked, the very ones that had taken our positions. They were sitting in our luxurious trenches behind the barbed wire fences we had lined up and killing the Japanese. We were disappointed, not that we were not attacked on the ridge, but that we were not down there. We were glad that the enemy did not show up on the ridge because we did not feel protected here. They would have swept us away without much difficulty, though we might have been able to hold them off a little. We found out in the morning that we were expendable in the evening too. Nay, didn't you know, asked one of those machine gunners who had taken up positions farther up the ridge, that we had received orders to open fire on anyone who appeared on the ridge. Really, what if it had been us? If we had gotten too hot and retreated? What do you think? The guy shrugged his shoulders. You think we'd check your discharge papers? Blow your asses off? Big Guy's eyes widened, and he let out a long curse. God damn it. No one reprimanded me for moving the firing point unauthorized. When I explained to the lieutenant my rationale for the decision and how much better the new position was, he agreed. Now we could crossfire with the gentleman, and if my machine gun was suppressed, the gentleman could open mounted fire. On the ridge we set up a real fortress. We cleared the edges of the gorges, barbed wire on the flat areas. The jungle was littered with hand grenade traps. We filled canisters with gasoline and fastened them to trees so that they could be seen from the firing points. Now we could easily set them on fire with an incendiary bullet. We brought 105mm shells from the artillerymen and buried them in the jungle, preparing them for detonation with electric wires stretched into our trenches. We dug single trenches between firing points, and later trenches between trenches. All in all, the ridge on which we with machine guns and the riflemen of Company G had entrenched ourselves was fortified quite competently. Finally we surveyed the jungle in front of us for any flat spots where the enemy, if he appeared, would be most likely to set up mortars or machine guns, and took them under the closest observation. All of them were perfectly shot through. As we worked, the hideously bright sun was scorching absolutely mercilessly. There was not a single tree on the ridge. There was no shade anywhere, only if you huddled at the bottom of a trench, and by midday the heat there was unbearable. We were sweating, and the sores on our arms and legs were blooming. There was a real despair in any of us over even the most trifling scratches, which could not be avoided in such an abundance of barbed wire. We knew that all the flies in the neighbourhood would instantly fly to the blood, but there was nothing we could do. Only by being in constant motion was it possible to keep the pesky fat flies at bay. We were at a high altitude above sea level, but it did not bother the flies. Mosquitoes did not come here, but flies were abundant. Sometimes too much pus would accumulate in the ulcer, and it would become unbearably painful. Then Red, our orderly, would draw a rust-stained scalpel from his sack and open the ulcer. If it looked too scary, Red would ask, How long have you had it? About a week. Really? He'd ask in a social tone, like a man discussing the beautiful zinnias in his neighbour's garden, then stick the scalpel into the wound, with all the diligence of a craftsman serious about his work. Rick, a lad in my ward, suffered a great deal from festering sores. They made his leg seem twice as thick. In addition, he, like Red, suffered greatly from the heat. Both had thin, delicate and very white skin, but they reacted differently to their ordeal. The Brick could not stand it. Whenever the sun reached its zenith, he retreated to the trench and lay with his face pressed against the water canisters and a wet rag over his forehead. Sometimes he felt so ill that he could hardly move. Only an assignment to a work party going to cooler regions or a blessed rainfall saved him from daily agony. And Red was becoming a mole. His helmet was always pulled over his eyes, and he wrapped his body as if he were not in the tropics but in the Arctic. And he'd withdraw into himself. He hardly spoke to us and opened his mouth only if he needed urgent medical advice, and he always spoke with a magnificent aplomb that could only be matched by the stunning ignorance of his interlocutor. Sometimes he would launch into long monologues about whether he could get a job somewhere near his hometown of Utica, if he survived Guadalcanal. But that helmet, he wore it always and everywhere. He wore it for protection from heat and from bombs. He slept in it and bathed in it. It could often be seen standing in the middle of a small stream near the positions of Company E. He could always be recognized by his strangely white skin and the invariable helmet on his head. Read out about it or simply to shark. Red, take off that damn helmet, was to be met with a full-throated attack, was to be met with a look of fierce hatred. His face would become as angry as a beast, ready to attack. Soon the helmet became our obsession. In our opinion, it was a sign of Red's insanity, and if so, then who was next? We longed to get rid of it. The only thing we can do is to riddle her with bullets, said Hotun. We gathered at our usual spot on the hillside, midway between Hotan's foxhole and mine. Red sat off to the side, his eyes closed as usual with his helmet pulled over them. Big Guy was the first to react. We will shoot. Ear, replied Hohotun. Why you? We'll draw lots. Hohotun started to protest, but we were outnumbered. It turned out it wasn't worth arguing with him. He drew the right straw anyway. Runner distracts Red by talking. I come up behind him and knock off his helmet, and Hohotun pours machine gun fire on it as it rolls down the hill. The runner immediately took over. He sat down next to Red and asked loudly what his plans were after returning from Guadalcanal. Red immediately saddled his favourite horse. He talked about his dear heart Utica, and I crept up behind him and knocked his helmet off his head. And then Hotun's machine gun started talking. The double shock of the loss of the helmet and the sudden rumble of gunfire made Red jump up. He clutched his head with both hands, the brightly flaming top of his head, as if he wanted to make sure that it had not been blown off along with his helmet. A look of wild horror was written on his face. Everyone sitting around took an active part in the action. They cheered us up with shouts, gave us advice on how best to aim at the rolling target. It's rolling good. Hip, hip, hooray. That's the way to go. Hey, Red, how you feeling without your tin can? Don't miss, boy. Shoot that thing so it'll be dead. Covered in bullet holes. The helmet disappeared from sight. The runner shouted to Hotun to stop firing and rushed down to see what was left of the helmet. When he found the tattered headgear, he solemnly brought it back and threw it at Red's feet. He looked at the remains of the helmet with unconcealed horror. Then he looked back at us. There was no hatred in his eyes. There were tears in them. He looked at us with the eyes of a mortally wounded animal that had been struck from an unexpected direction. In our hearts we hoped he would laugh, but he wept and ran away from us. As it turned out, he went to the battalion's utility room and stayed there until a new helmet was found for him. Then he was with difficulty persuaded to go back. He became even more reserved, kept to himself at all times, and from then on his new helmet was always fastened firmly with a strap under his chin. No one else had any desire to deprive him of his helmet again, or to make jokes about the circumstances under which he had lost his old one. It was November. More than 3 months had passed since our landing. All through October the Japanese had been attacking our division's positions. They would come up at night to some part of the perimeter, attack with a narrow front and advance slightly. In the morning they would be thrown back with heavy casualties. After that it was the same thing all over again. The Japanese did not relent. It is unlikely that in our 3 infantry regiments, the 1st, 5th and 7th, there was at least one battalion that would not have had a chance to participate in the battle, and the puppies of the 164th Infantry were not spared by the war. And the Japanese kept coming. Sometimes we saw replenishment being unloaded from transports that came up to Kokumbona. Sometimes our old Airacobras would take off to bomb the transports or strafe them from strafing. We were always very happy to see them flying over our heads on their way to their potential victims. The sight of our planes attacking the enemy was always exciting and left no one indifferent. And the Japanese kept coming. Now they had heavy artillery, and even tanks were seen in the Matanikau River area. They attacked our positions every night, every time they were repulsed, but every night we had to wait for them. Time moved in intermittent jumps. As a child breathes sharply, jerkily, frightened by the sounds coming from the darkness. Every night we held our breath and looked down from the ridge into the gorges, trying to see sandy beaches, rivers, shelters at the airfield. We were all becoming one, some giant organism holding its breath to keep from missing the sound of the invasion, and only in the morning did we get a chance to take a loud, long, delightful exhalation. And they kept coming. They brought their airplanes with them, new, beautiful, shiny, like flying fish. that had inadvertently flown too high into the bright blue sky. Sometimes before the bombing began or after the bombing was over, air battles would play out over the ridge, with the planes so close that you could seem to reach them with your hand. One day Zero fell out of a group of airplanes, thinking he was going to play with us. Hohotoon got very angry, pulled out a machine gun and returned fire on the finally naked enemy. He knew that it was almost impossible to hit a flying airplane in this way, but he could not restrain himself. He didn't like it when the Jeps were fooling around like that. He was cursing fiercely, cursing at the insolent bastard who had hunted us down. "Lucky," he yelled. "What are you waiting for? Help?" I ran to help, but Zero was coming faster. Before I could reach my comrade, he was already roaring over our heads. As I noticed the columns of dust raised by the bullets striking the ground and heard the melodious clatter of empty shell casings on the rocks, I turned and ran away. Hohotoon sprawled on the ground. I ran. The airplane behind me roared and spat out deadly bullets with a loud bark. I jumped down the hillside that contained the cave we had left the first night. Zero rumbled onward, and I landed on a flat ledge 2 meters below. Eight at the top, crestfallen, continued to curse. I climbed up to him, helped him to set up the machine gun properly and load it, and then we waited for Zero to return. He made a turn and was approaching again. "Come on, you son of a bitch," muttered Hohotoon, watching the enemy machine with hateful eyes. "Come closer, you're going to get hurt." And again bullets rattled around. Dust columns danced. Our machine gun began to speak at the top of its voice. We were determined to get the bastard, but at the same time 2 air cobras appeared from the side of the ridge, and Zero disappeared. I'm just saying he disappeared. I suppose he was blown to molecules, disintegrated under the fierce fire of the cannons mounted in the nose of the aero cobras. I didn't hear the explosion, though, perhaps because the ridge was a barrier to many of the sounds that accompanied group air battles, airfield bombing, and anti-aircraft fire. By the way, our anti-aircraft batteries gave us a lot of trouble. Anti-aircraft shells flew upward, exploded in the air, and our ridge often sounded like a xylophone reacting to falling shrapnel. We took cover from this rain of danger just as much as from enemy bullets and bombs. It was uncomfortable if for some reason you wandered far from safe shelter and saw an enemy plane approaching, surrounded by black blasts, and then heard the melodious clatter of shrapnel on the rocks. One clear and warm afternoon in mid-November, I was just at the battalion command post when an air alert was announced and a squadron of enemy planes appeared in the sky, flying in a V-shaped formation. Our air defense batteries opened fire, trying to get them to turn away and drop their deadly cargo on the jungle without hurting anyone. Very quickly I was left alone. Everyone had taken cover. I scurried from foxhole to foxhole looking for a free corner, but everything was crowded. Eventually I reached the officers' shelter, set up on the hillside. Shrapnel was already falling all round me, tapping out a melodious fugue on the rocks, when I threw aside the burlap blocking the entrance to the shelter and stared straight into the menacing, unblinking glass eye of Captain Big Ura. What unparalleled contempt was written on his face. I felt like a ticket holder in a common carriage trying to get into a luxurious compartment. His hostility was as palpable as a slap in the face. At the same minute I hated Captain Big Hurrah and all members of his class. I mumbled an apology and hastily let go of the sackcloth. Thus I was left alone again on the ridge in the rain of shrapnel. But let me rather perish here than have my presence tolerated there. Yet I received not a scratch, but my sensibility was injured. The souvenir appeared while we were on the ridge. I had not seen him since Tinaroo. Now he was one of 6 snipers in regimental reconnaissance. At intervals of a week or so he would go down into the jungle to do reconnaissance on Grassy Knoll. With him went a Marine sergeant, a lumbering silent man with a lush mane of red hair on his massive head and a huge red beard that made him look like a Christmas Santa Claus. He never opened his mouth as they travelled down our hill, but Souvenir loved the good-natured jokes that always accompanied his appearance, and he never left a single one unanswered. "Hey, Souvenir, where are your tongs?" "You know me, boys," he grinned, patting his back pocket. "I'd rather forget my rifle." How about a trade, Souvenir? I'll give you $10 for the pouch you got around your neck." "I know what you mean," laughed Souvenir. "Maybe you'd like a pint of my blood, too." How many teeth you got in that bag?" "That's my own business." 100? Anything's possible." With a grin in his moustache, Souvenir disappeared into the jungle. His famous pouch of golden Japanese teeth always drew a lot of attention to him. Even in Souvenir's absence, this pouch was often the subject of discussion. I wonder how many teeth he has in there after all. I have no idea, but a guy in his platoon said he'd gotten 50 of them on Hell Point alone. That was 3 months ago. And he's been on regular scouting trips the whole time. I'm guessing he's got at least 75 grand in there. That's a couple $1,000, no less. God damn it. I'd like to have that kind of money when we get back to the States. I'd get a hotel room and... What makes you think you're going to come back to the States? Anybody who thinks they're going home again is crazy. We've got to survive on this devil's island. Even if some of us are lucky, we're not going home anytime soon. Fuck it. We were getting angry and frustrated. Our strength was waning by the day, and many of us were falling into a kind of severe physical depression. Often we spent all our strength to get to the galley. Still, to do this, we had first to go down the hill into the ravine where the galley was set up, and then climb back. Sometimes, if the rain was particularly heavy, we would skip meals, forgetting to eat, even if our stomachs were hungry. It was getting too slippery on the hillside, and this obstacle could well become insurmountable. Rain. The rainy season had arrived. There was no shelter from them on the ridge, and they came down upon us in torrents. It only took a few seconds to get soaked to the skin. The first thing we did was to gnash our teeth from the cold and frantically search our pockets for precious cigarettes in order to transfer them to the saving dryness of our helmets. However, it was often too late, and they had to resign themselves to the irretrievable death of this surprisingly perishable product in conditions of high humidity. After cigarettes, one had to take care of ammunition. The water running down the slope penetrated our trenches as if they were sewer manholes. So we had to rush up there and get the ammunition boxes out of the way of the water currents, placing them on top of each other in the few dry spots. All the dry areas of the trenches were used for ammunition storage. Those who hid there from the rain sat on water canisters. There were times when it would rain for a whole day, or even for more than one day. In such cases, I would lie drenched and shivering at the bottom of the trench and only occasionally look out to make sure once again that our ridge was at the mercy of endless streams of water pouring from the sky. A grey shroud of rain enveloped everything around us, and it seemed that it would always be like that. On days like this, the human brain refuses to function. It sinks somewhere into the dark depths as red blood cells move away from the surface of the body in moments of excitement. Man ceases to be a rational. Thinking being becomes oversensitive, something like a clam glued to the bottom of a ship. He feels that he is still alive, feels cold and damp, but is not capable of conscious action. In such a state, he has only one path, the direct road to madness. After turning into a mindless snail for a while, I made a discovery. It turns out that even in cold moisture there is warmth. I was the only one on the ridge with a camping bunk. I set it up in my foxhole. On it I carefully laid out my mud-splattered cloak. We were not allowed to come to the surface so as not to be seen by the enemy. I burrowed deeper into my paw and sometimes, by taking steps to drain it and wrapping myself in my cloak, even stayed relatively dry. But if the rain was too heavy or prolonged, nothing helped. The trench would fill with water, which would rise to the level of my bed, and I would find myself lying in a puddle. It was very cold. The cold penetrated to the very bones. The debilitating heat of the day before had numbed our blood to carry heat through our bodies. I finally dragged my bed out onto the hillside in disgust. To hell with her and me, too. Let me get shot by some Japanese. If that short-sighted bastard could see anything behind the dense veil of rain, and if he was dumb enough to want to. I spread the moisture-soaked blanket on the bed and pulled the other one over the top. Miracles, I felt warm. It was wet, but very cozy. It was pouring and dripping all around, but it was warm. I realized I looked pathetic, but Look at me, if you will, and you will understand what war in the Pacific is like. Look at our ridge, towering like a giant whale above the green sea of jungle. Look over the hill and see if you can find any signs of life. You won't find any. Don't even try. All you'll see is a grey wall of rain, a camping cot, and a little man huddled under a drenched blanket. But he's happy. He, and known in the whole world, knows how delightfully warm it can be under a wet blanket. The runner had an attack of malaria. He was held in the battalion field hospital for a few days and then sent back to his position. He lay in his hole, unable even to eat. When the chills hit him, we carried him our blankets. When the fever broke and sweat began to trickle from every pore of his body, he lay on his back and smiled blissfully. He could hardly speak, but he kept whispering, "God, it feels good. How pleasant. It's so cool." In mid-November, we learned that a crisis had arrived. Our division continued to push back the Japanese, even sometimes going on the offensive. The opposing forces were probably equal, but the crisis was obvious, and it came exactly in the middle of November. It hung in the air, became part of the atmosphere. As a man can feel the presence of the enemy in the darkness, so we felt the approach of something big and hostile. Fresh Japanese units were approaching from the north. If they succeeded, they would wipe us off the face of the earth. But on the eve of a crisis, there is always a period of unfounded optimism. And just before our crisis, a flotilla entered the bay very briskly, and we were confident that the long-awaited reinforcements had arrived. "No way," shouted Sordi, losing his usual aplomb for a moment. Our fleet is back. Look at the strait. Look at that. A cruiser and 3 destroyers." We hurried to the crest of the ridge, where we had a magnificent view of the northern part of Guadalcanal, the sea, and the nearby islands. From this distance, the strait seemed like a blue lagoon, but there really were warships there. We began to clap each other on the shoulders, shake hands, even dancing a little from the excess of feelings. Hohotun runner, Stump, big guy, all of us were straining our eyes, trying to see the approaching transports. So far, there was no sign of them. And then the question arose. Who says it's ours? Silence. Pretty soon the ship's guns gave the answer. They were firing at our island, in the bright light of day, with magnificent arrogance. Armed not only with guns, but above all with contempt, they sent volley after volley in the direction of the airfield, sank a few small craft that had been in their way, passed through the strait, probably to make sure that our ships were not there, and returned to where they had come from. Around the stern of each was the water bubbling and foaming. A shame. Our very rich vocabulary of profanity was not complete enough to express the feelings that overwhelmed us: bitterness, despair, disappointment. When we returned to our hill, we began to discuss what had happened, desperately trying to ease at least a little the tension that had grown after what we had seen. That night we did not hurry to disperse, but sat for a long time near Hohotun's trench, even though the night was dark and seemed to favour sleep, remembering how we had tried in vain to have fun when the nights were still bright, looking for fun where there was none and could not be. Eventually everyone went to their holes. It was the sea battle that brought us to our feet. The night darkness was broken by the excited voice of the usually imperturbable swordsman. "Wake up, boys, a sea battle. You can see everything from here." I often think of Judgment Day, of God's judgment. I think of stars exploding, planets disappearing in a blaze of flame. I think of volcanoes, of gigantic energy releases, of holocausts, yet I cannot put into words all that I witnessed standing on the crest of the ridge. Flares hung in the darkness, red like the eye of the devil, and therefore even more horrible. Tracer shells drew orange arcs in the dark sky. Sometimes we involuntarily pulled our heads into our shoulders. It seemed to us that they were stretching straight towards us, although they were many kilometers away. The sea seemed like a polished obsidian tabletop on which someone had scattered warships in a mess, surrounding them in concentric circles, the way circular waves spread around a stone thrown into standing water. Our island shuddered, responding to the powerful sounds from there. In the very center of the blackness, a luminous dot appeared. It grew and finally flooded the world, including us, with a pale yellow light. Then it gave a terrible, simply nightmarish roar, and all of us were involuntarily seized with fear. It seemed to us that the island was slipping from under our feet, the ridge shaking like a giant whale trying to free itself from a harpoon that had struck it. Iron had crashed into the living, wet flesh. A great ship had exploded. We could not even guess whose ship it was. All we could do was to sit or lie on the hillside and watch, breathless, the naval battle in progress, and when it was over, to spread out in our trenches and wait for dawn, talking quietly and trying to keep our hearts from beating. If the results were not vital to us, we could probably be compared to fans eager to know the outcome of the last World Cup. The roar of the many engines on the airfield told us that victory was still ours. From the very dawn of dawn, from the airfield began to take off our planes, which rushed in pursuit of the enemy fleet. The roar of their engines seemed to us as triumphant as the march from Ada. We expressed our joy in every possible way, and waved our hands to all the planes flying over our heads, cheered them up, wished for more direct hits to sweep the Japanese armada from the surface of the sea as soon as possible, to send it into oblivion. It was all very exhilarating. The roar of airplane engines was constantly present in the air over our heads. They flew away and returned all day long, even the oldest and most worn out, and we never tired of greeting them with cheers and wishing them good luck. The whole of Guadalcanal was alive with hope, trembling, smelling the odour of victory. We reminded ourselves of convicts from whom heavy fetters suddenly shone. A gigantic weight was lifted from our shoulders. The enemy is fleeing. The siege was lifted, and all day long the air over the island was filled with the rumbling of engines and the thanksgiving rising to the heavens. Ah, how sweet the air was that day! How fresh and pure it was! What powerful vitality filled our weary bodies, to be consumed and born again. It seemed as if our souls had left their old bodily shells, filled with hopeless melancholy, left them to lie in the mud, a heap of dirty, tattered rags, and entered into others, sparkling with the hope and joy of life. On Guadalcanal, events changed their direction. Hohotun discovered a scorpion in his belongings, which he kept in his foxhole. "Hey, Lucky," we shouted. "I have a scorpion in my things. Come here quickly." I came immediately and stared at the furry crab-like creature, wiggling its fearsome tail threateningly. Let's see if they can really commit suicide. Crestfallen picked up a rock and pounded hard on the bottom of the crate, cornering the scorpion. The blow came pretty close to where it was sitting. We watched. Breathless, we watched as its tail quivered, slowly rose up, arched, and dug into the scorpion's back. It twitched a few times and went quiet. It seemed to die. "I'll be damned," exhaled Hohotun. "Did you see that?" He wanted to turn the box over and shake the dead scorpion to the ground, but I suggested we wait a little longer to be sure. We moved farther away from the trench and left the scorpion there. When we returned 5 minutes later, we found that the scorpion was gone. "Oh my goodness," Hohotun was indignant. "You can't trust anyone, not even Scorpion." Hohotun and I started to supply our platoon with food. Lieutenant Ivy let us go on a free search, like hunting dogs, and now every day we stuck our pistols behind the straps of our sunburned pants, which we had long ago cut above the knees, took empty bags, put on helmets, and went down the ridge. We had to go down on foot, but at the bottom we could count on hitchhikers. Our goal was a food warehouse, which was set up not far from our first defensive positions on the ocean. After the defeat of the Japanese fleet, Guadalcanal had received quite a lot of food. But it was distributed, as in all armies since Agamemnon, so it hadn't even begun to arrive at the front lines yet. It went straight to the galleys and into the stomachs of representatives of headquarters and other rear units located far enough from the front line. In other words, those who are always envied and despised by all front-line soldiers. We considered all these supplies to be rightfully ours, regardless of whether they were behind the barbed wire of the food warehouse or in the tents of the rear men. We obtained them by any means available. To secure food, we could steal, beg, lie. When we jumped off the back of the truck that brought us closer to the goal of our journey, the first thing we did was to head for the heavily guarded food warehouse. We had to crawl to it, getting close to the fence, where we could not be seen by the sentries, who sat with rifles on their knees on high stacks of crates. We tore up the soft earth under the fence and crept inside. Hiding behind the stacks, we moved forward in search of canned fruit, beans, spaghetti, Vienna sausages. Sometimes we could even find ground sausage. Can you believe it? Real sausage meat. And even if some people in the States think processed pork, which everyone calls sausage meat, is poison, in Guadalcanal, it was a recognized delicacy. We often risked a bullet by purposefully making our way to the crates of this delicious product and pulling them from the very stack on which the sentry was perched. This is exactly how a mouse carries cheese right out of the paws of a sleeping cat. After a while, the need for such precautions disappeared. The food warehouse became the most popular place on the island. The roads leading here were filled with robbers like us, pistols at their belts or rifles on their shoulders, empty sacks in their hands. Now they didn't look like spies, but like a weekend stroll around the stadium. So many loopholes had appeared under the fence that it was possible to enter the warehouse anywhere. Once inside, the bearded Marines felt like masters. They gladly tore open boxes, opened crates, took what they liked and tossed the rest aside. When they had filled their sacks, they proudly departed, disregarding the orders of the sentries. Understandably, such an invasion emptied the warehouse rather quickly and led to increased security. Then we turned our eyes to the ships. After a sea battle, our ships were almost always anchored in the straits. We hoped to exchange the Marines' only possessions, stories and gossip, for the mariners' delicious coffee, and if we were lucky, something sweet. We would wait until the dinghy approaching the shore was empty, then walk to the helmsman. "Hey, sailor, how about a ride to your ship?" There was no insolence here, nothing impertinent or defiant. It was more like a game, and we were like children standing on the doorstep of a candy store on Christmas Eve. We tried to make the sailors feel at ease, to make them forget about the rule forbidding Marines from visiting ships. We did not fear for ourselves. And how could we be punished here? But the sailors had to be persuaded. It often happened that when the boat was already approaching the board, the officer of the watch, who noticed us, began to shout, "No, absolutely not. Helmsman, get the Marines ashore immediately. You know they're not allowed to come aboard. Do you understand me?" "But, sir," one of us interjected, "I just wanted to visit my countrymen. There's no harm in my friends and me seeing a comrade, is there? We lived in the neighbourhood on the same street. You could say we grew up together. I haven't seen him since the war started. He was at my grandmother's bedside when she was dying." Now it was up to the officer, how willing he was to be deceived. If he asked what a comrade's name was, all was lost. If he was foolish enough to believe this obvious lie, or just smirked and turned away, then it was safe to grab the rope ladder and climb on deck. Once on the ship, there was nothing to fear. We told all kinds of stories and treated ourselves to excellent coffee, exchanged souvenirs for food and sweets. A circle of sailors gathered around us in the galley at once. We were always the centre of attention. So the Japanese went straight to the bayonets, as if they were not afraid of death. The sailor asked, filling our mugs with fragrant coffee again. "Exactly so," Mutt followed the answer. "We found drugs on them. They all had syringes and drug packets with them. They'd get high before they attacked, and then they'd go on the rampage." "Is it true the Marines cut off their ears?" "Yeah. I know a guy who's got a whole collection, mostly after the battle at Hell Point. That's on Tipara, you know. He hung them up on a rope to dry, but it didn't work. As luck would have it, the rains came and they all rotted. And then we heard a voice from the thicket, and you know what the motherfucker said. 'Fuck you all.' There was laughter, and we held out our empty cups for another round. On some ships, the sailors were particularly generous, and then we would return to our ridge with bags filled with sweets and necessities such as razor blades, bars of soap, toothbrushes, and other prized trophies. I must admit that we were by no means disinterested in their distribution, especially when it came to sweets. We felt that everyone's contribution to the spoils should be taken into account. In other words, we kept the sweets for ourselves. One day, hearing that the 8th Marine Regiment, the Hollywood Marines, had come to our shores and brought a military store with them, Hotun and I went on a raid. We found 2 tents and 2 guards standing in front of each tent holding rifles with bayonets fixed, and behind the tents began thick thickets, an unguarded rear, unprotected rear. Did they really think that the thickets, however dense, were impassable? Did they really think their possessions safe under the protection of the almost paper back of the tent? Surprised and puzzled, we retired in council to the location of the nearest artillery battery. After exchanging views, we came to the unanimous opinion that there was every reason to expect a complete defeat of the 8th Marine Regiment. We drew up a plan. I was to enter the jungle and make my way to the back of the larger of the tents. I would have 2 sacks on me. After a quarter of an hour, Ho-Hun would have to approach the tent and strike up a conversation with the sentries. When I heard the voices, I should sneak into the tent, fill the sacks and hide in the jungle. As I began to make my way to the tent, the cold gloom of the jungle came in handy. My cleaver was very sharp, so I easily made my way through the intricacy of lianas and creeping plants, blocking my way. I had to be very careful, so I moved forward slowly. I had to get through without disturbing any birds that might give me away. When I finally reached the back of the tent, I was soaking wet. The palm of my hand, which was clutching the handle, was also damp, and I was afraid that at the most inopportune moment the knife would slip out. I could hear voices as I approached, which meant that I was taking longer than I'd expected. When I touched the rough surface of the tarpaulin, I felt a rush of excitement. Running a sharp blade across the stretched canvas, I made a hole and immediately smelled a pungent odour. The tent smelled strongly of creosote. I had to widen the hole slightly to allow air and light in. The boxes were stacked high. I began to look at the writing on them. Mostly there were cigarettes. It was a mockery. Cigarettes were not a problem on Guadalcanal, but there were many more crates, and I kept moving my sweat-drenched eyes from one to another, looking for what I needed. Soon enough I found a crate that, judging by the writing on the side, contained cookies. I wasted no time in searching further, urged on by the voices of Hohotun and the guards, and began to transfer the contents of the box into sacks. As I busied myself with this important task, I felt the greed in me speak. "Take more," she insisted. "You can get a lot more out of here into the jungle." I hesitated for a moment, but decided to listen to my inner voice and resumed my work. After filling one bag, I stood up to catch my breath and listened. Crestfallen's loud laughter came easily through the tarp walls. I leaned over to continue the case, and my gaze came across an open drawer in a neighbouring stack. There were cigars in there. If cookies were worth their weight in gold on Guadalcanal, cigars were worth their weight in platinum. Only whiskey was more valuable, but there was no whiskey on Guadalcanal. Until recently, I may have stumbled upon the only batch of them on the island. I was about to empty the bag of cookies when I realized that 5 boxes of cigars would fit into the second bag. I quickly stowed them, threw one bag on my back, took the other in my hands, and, holding it in front of me, slipped out of the stinking heat of the tent and into the coolness of the jungle. With the sack securely hidden, I stepped out and joined Crestfallen. Seeing me, he grinned contentedly. "Hey, what the hell are you doing here? Looking for something bad lying around?" He nudged the guard lightly with his elbow and lowered his voice, deliberately. "You keep an eye on him. He's from Jersey, and you've got to keep an eye on him. If you turn your back, he'll snatch something." He looked at me again with a grin, and I could see the little devils dancing in his eyes. But the sentry, in all probability, did not think the joke a good one. He was wary, his lips tightly pressed together, and the hand that held his rifle tensed. That Hohotun. What's his problem? Not only did we have to stick our heads into the lion's mouth, but he decided to tease the predator. I chuckled as cheerfully as possible, and after a few minutes I managed to get him away from the sentries. "You're a crazy bastard," I said when we were a safe distance away. "What were you trying to accomplish?" Desperate to convince my buddy of the impropriety of such behaviour, I shrugged and quickened my pace. We left only to return cautiously in a few hours for our prey. Back on the ridge, we had the opportunity to fully enjoy the shameless flattery, even subservience, of those around us. We shared the cookies with our comrades and kept the cigars for ourselves. After that, for many days officers came to our trench in a steady stream, a real pilgrimage. And even a major from the pilots came. Everyone wanted to get the coveted cigar. They were all smiling ingratiatingly, full of false friendliness and unusually generous with unfulfilled promises. We gave them none. We knew we were winning. We knew it from the very moment our high-speed P-38 fighters appeared in the sky over the island. They passed over our heads one afternoon as we weaved our way down the hillside for another meal. The pistol Petes had just shelled the area near us. When we heard the roar of the engines, our first thought was to run, but then we saw a familiar silhouette swooping over the jungle roof. We were overjoyed. When the pistol Petes went on the attack again, we of course cursed them, but without malice. After all, they had revived hope in our hearts. Returning to the ridge, where our comrades were waiting their turn to go to eat, we passed a small stream in which all were washing and washing. 2 men were having a bath day there, Souvenir and his red-bearded scouting partner with the appearance of Santa Claus. They were scraping their bodies with exasperation and yelling at each other. We stopped to listen. Still not catching the gist of the argument, Hohotun inquired. "What the hell is going on here?" The red-bearded man replied. "This simpleton claims we've got it cooler here than Wake Island." He looked at Souvenir with disdain and then turned to us. "That's stupid." "Why stupid?" Souvenir exploded. "How do you know? The trouble with you old men. You're sure that everyone who joined the Marines after Pearl Harbor is worthless. You weren't on Wake Island, by the way, and I say, compared to our island, it's a picnic." The red-bearded man was indignant to the core. Turning his back to his comrade and handing him the soap to lather her up, he trembled with rage. Picnic. How dare you? By the way, your ass wasn't there either. So what? I read the papers. It says it's twice as bad as Wake Island. Tell me, how many times have they been bombed there? It don't make no difference. How many of them are left? They weren't all killed. Most of them were captured. How many surrendered? That's right. What do you say to that? The red-bearded man turned around again, automatically took his soap from Souvenir and took a breath to rush back to the attack. Don't talk about them surrendering. You sissies like to judge others. At Wake they said, send us more Japanese. What do our boys say? When are we going home? His lips above his red beard curved mockingly, and there was frank sarcasm in his voice. Our biggest thoughts are when the mama's boys can go home to show off in their navy uniforms to the girls. The verbal duel flared and faded. The argument, as usual, ended in nothing. The Marine Corps was always in a state of ferment. It was divided into two camps, the old men and the lappers, who were constantly feuding. The old men defended the past and tradition against the fierce onslaught of the sledges, eager to exalt the present at any cost at the expense of the past, eager to rob the old men of their aplomb at the expense of diminishing their merit. The sledge will always feel inferior to the old man, so he always attacks without having enough confidence to defend himself. The moment he stops attacking tradition with the sharpened sabre of today's accomplishments, the second he holds his hand with the weapon and begins to calmly evaluate events. He leaves the ranks of the saga forever and becomes an old man. This is how the transition from the ranks of young rebels to the ranks of their more restrained older comrades is accomplished. If this process stops and one camp becomes clearly dominant, the US Marines will cease to win victories. That's exactly what I was thinking as I climbed up the hillside. I was grateful to Redbeard for reminding us of the Wake Island steamers, and I had no doubt that, upon calm reflection, he would lose some of his contempt for us. We reached the trenches in silence. It was only here that it was broken by the big men. Do you think Souvenir was telling the truth about the papers, about Guadalcanal becoming famous? Of course not, stated the Hotu-Tune. I bet nobody ever wrote about us. Don't say that, said the big man thoughtfully. I think he was telling the truth. Then he turned to me and asked, do you think, Lucky, we could have a parade in New York? The answer immediately followed from Lucky. His eyes sparkled dreamily at the thought of such a possibility. Wow, that would be something. That's not a bad idea, big guy. Imagine we're walking down a street lined with girls. He paused and returned his face to its more typical expression of mocking contempt. Forget it, there's no parade. New York doesn't even know we're still alive, and no one there has ever heard of Yes, they have, said the big guy. I'm sure we're very well known back home. There won't be any parade in New York anyway. Mahotun intervened again. If we're so famous, who knows? We might have to march down Main Street with a band. Can you imagine? Say that again, said the runner. Up to this point he had been silently and sullenly biting his thumbnail. At the thought of a parade he smiled, looked at me and spoke again. And if we have a parade, where do you think, Lucky? Well, on Fifth Avenue? No. You're probably thinking of St. Patrick's Day. That's where the Irish parades are. Broadway, maybe. Everywhere, Chuckles nodded dreamily. There'll be plenty of good old firewater. Right, Lucky? And 30 days vacation each. And 2 girls, one white and one black. There won't be no parade, Big Guy announced grimly. To hell with it. As soon as we get ashore, I personally intend to get out of the ranks and blend in. That's not bad, said the runner. Imagine we go ashore and everybody runs away. No one will ever find us in the New York crowd. We'll all be drunk and nobody will stop us. Everyone will be drunk, even the officers. There was silence for a few minutes. Everyone was dreaming about something else. The silence was broken again by Biggie. I think we'll have a parade after all. A few things had changed in our lives. First, the skies over Guadalcanal became American, and second, the mail began to arrive regularly. Both events gave us a great deal of optimism. Personally, I was over the moon when I received a letter from my father. It, by the way, caused a stir among all the inhabitants of the ridge. I read it while squatting on the hillside. Before this there had been a heavy rain, which had filled all our trenches with water in a moment, followed by a completely unexpected invasion of ant-like insects. There were so many of them that we had to shield our eyes from them and keep our mouths shut. They fell to the ground, covering it with a rather dense blanket. That's why I was careful and squatted. I didn't want to soil my freshly washed pants in mud or dead insects. Robert, wrote my father, your naval uniform is ready. Shall I send it to you? Yes. I remembered how unattainably beautiful the blue uniforms of the Marines had seemed to me. I was squatting on an island at the end of the world, surrounded by wild, drenched wilderness and myriad insect corpses. I sat, dressed only in pants cut above the knees and a pair of moccasins stolen from an army depot, and imagined myself in all the splendor of a parade uniform. Robert, your uniform is ready. Shall I send it to you? Word travels fast on the ridge. And while we stayed on the ridge, I was the lucky one whose old man wants to send him a set of uniforms. I was on my way to lunch and I heard from all sides. Hey, Lucky, did your old man send you a uniform yet? Boy, how's your new uniform? I was still just approaching, and people were already smiling around me. I guess people were envisioning the 1st Marine Division arriving on our ridge, in dress uniform, with banners flying and a band playing. There was no teasing or hooting, no one teased me. Just quiet smiles and good-natured pinning. I had the impression that my father's more than original suggestion should be carefully guarded as an old family joke, a fantasy to keep one's sanity on a crazy island. Everyone thought my father was a great guy and often inquired about his health. Sergeant Dandy brought some bad news. He had visited us the day before to take measurements for new clothes. The conclusions we drew from his visit were so encouraging that we spent the night speculating, one more pleasant than the other. We were sure we were leaving Guadalcanal. But where would they send us? But Sergeant Dandy quickly eliminated the general jubilant. So, prepare yourselves. We leave Matapicoa in the morning for another offensive. Pack your gear, prepare your weapons, and keep your ammunition dry. We'll be replaced by the 8th Marine Regiment. He fell silent, and we looked at each other sadly. His face remained completely impassive. It did not even reflect the satisfaction of a messenger who had brought bad news. Sergeant Dandy's heart, like so many others, had long since been petrified. No, don't ask me what it all means. Don't ask me any stupid questions at all. Just do what I say, he concluded and departed. And that was after we'd been here for 5 interminable months. Runner had malaria. Brick hardly ever came out of his foxhole except at night. Big Guy and Stump were prone to bouts of severe depression. I had dysentery. Hohotum became incredibly irritable, and we were all exhausted and weakened beyond measure. And now we had to go on the attack. We could hardly even go to lunch, and we were being asked to attack the enemy. We were desperate. In the morning we gathered at the machine guns, waiting for the order to dismantle them and move out. It didn't come. Nor did it come the next day, and the day after that. Gradually hope returned to us. She came crawling back blushing, ashamed of her hasty, cowardly flight, and promised not to do it again. One morning Sergeant Dandy relayed an order to us. Leave the machine guns behind. Take only your personal weapons, ammunition and personal effects. Then he grinned contentedly and added, we are being replaced. It was December 14, 1942. We had been in positions without a break since August 7. My battalion, the 2nd Battalion, 1st Regiment, was the last of the 1st Marine Division to leave the positions. With Guadalcanal, everything was smoked. We had won. We were coming down the ridge in a fine drizzle, and some guys from the 8th Marine Regiment were walking toward us. They were wearing helmets, just like the ones our fathers wore during World War I, and the British still do. As they climbed up the slippery slope, they looked pathetic and very unhappy. We felt genuinely sorry for them, even realizing that the worst was over. But we couldn't help but tease them, these guys from San Diego in sunny California. Look, here they are, the Hollywood Marines. Let's see what we got here, huh? Hey guys, where's your military store? Yes, screw you. Shh, that's no way to talk. They don't do that in the movies. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Guys, what's the news in Hollywood? How's Paw Paw doing? Yeah, how's Paw Paw? Paw Turner? They tried to feign superiority, but they couldn't hide the envy that one who stays always feels when seeing those who leave. We were going down thin, exhausted but happy, and they were going up well-fed but full of misgivings. I said we were happy. And so we were. We were wildly, 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 wildly happy. We spent the next week in a tent, pitched where the ridge curves down to the Kupai fields. Hohota and I made periodic visits to the food store, and in the end we brought in so much food that I could afford to eat a large jar of canned apricots alone, giving myself a terrible upset stomach. I lay on my stomach, listening to the cutting pain in my gut, and groaned. I seem sick. I've eaten too much. How wonderful it is to be able to eat too much. Only the persistently repeated visits from washing machine Charlie reminded us that there was still Japanese left on Guadalcanal. We spent another week in the Gardens of Eden. We came to a campground set up at the mouth of the Lupka River. We were issued beer, and in sufficient quantity to get splendidly drunk every evening. In the afternoon we bathed in the Lupka, a marvellous river whose clear, cool water quenched the fire of malaria in the blood. Swimming in the river often became dangerous because of some wit who amused themselves by throwing hand grenades into the water. One day I heard excited shouts from the seashore, ran there and saw a giant stingray that someone had managed to catch in a net. It was, of course, already dead, pierced in 100 places by the bullets of the newcomers, who were only too glad to put their weapons to use in this way at least. We then spent the night waiting to be loaded on the ship. That afternoon we had Christmas presents delivered from home. We could not bring them aboard with us, only personal items and weapons were allowed. Hohotun and I had already asked Lieutenant Ivy, and I had asked Lieutenant Ivy to carry our remaining cigar boxes aboard. Officers were not restricted as much as we were. They still had sea duffels. We were surprised to see sea duffel bags again, and riddled with annoyance that only the officers had them. This was the first manifestation of discrimination we had encountered, the first fall of a coin, both sides of which were the same, by which our officers satisfied their greed by forbidding us to have things that were rightfully ours and taking them for themselves. So we selected what we could from the presents that had arrived from home and threw away the rest. Madhyasa Singh, Bapomad March. We went ashore, not yet realizing the value of the order we had received. We climbed into the waiting boats and then stood for a long time watching the distant shoreline. Our boat approached the side of a huge transport, and in doing so tilted so hard on its port side that I think it scooped up water. It was the President Wilson. Get on the nets. We came back the same way we left the transport. Only now we were so weak that many of us couldn't make the climb. They fell into the water with all their gear and had to be fished out. Some clung desperately to the net until their last strength left them, at which point the sea took them in. They were pulled out of the water by the nimble sailors who were deftly scrambling over the nets. I managed to reach the top of the net, but I could not go any further. I had not strength enough to fall over the planking, and I hung there breathing hard and feeling the ship swaying on the waves as if it were moving away from me, until 2 sailors took me under their arms and dragged me on deck. I collapsed among the others brought aboard in like manner, and lay for a long time with my cheek pressed against the warm deck. My heart pounded desperately with fatigue, or perhaps with happiness. Once below deck, Hohotun and I went in search of the galley, hot coffee, and pleasant conversationalists. We entered and seated ourselves at a table just as the last of the soldiers who had arrived on this transport rose to leave. He looked at us, greedily sipping coffee from large white mugs. "How was it out there?" he asked, shaking his head toward the shore. Cool," we said in unison. Then Hohotun, as if coming to his senses, asked, "You mean Guadalcanal?" The soldier seemed surprised. "Of course, what else?" I expressed myself wrongly, Hohotun hastened to explain. "I meant, have you heard of this place before? Before you came here?" His surprise was so obvious and huge that we stopped doubting. "You mean, hell, of course. This is Guadalcanal, 1st Marine Division. Everybody knows you. You guys are very famous. You're considered heroes back up." We didn't see him leave, for we both turned away hastily to hide our tears. We were not forgotten. There was no more celebration. Guadalcanal was a thing of the past, and with it the courage, the tenacity, the will not to let the jungle take over our sun-whitened bones. We had exhausted our vitality and were stupidly waiting for the big debauchement that Melbourne had in store for us. Already a requiem to the spirit of comradeship had been sounded, a lament for the departed ties that had existed between us Carolina officers and soldiers on Guadalcanal. Going aboard the President Wilson, we buried them. We were first brought to Espiritu Saptu in New Hebrides. We arrived there on Christmas Eve and were each given a lollipop by the chaplain, while Lieutenant Ivy pleasured the senior officers with our cigars. Then we practiced gunnery techniques for 3 weeks, while the officers reminded us that it is not only bad to mistreat dogs, but volunteers as well. Then we were sent to Australia. There was a band playing on the wharf at Melbourne. We saw land for the first time in a long time, for we had been below decks most of the time since leaving Espiritu, driven there by a terrible storm in the Tasman Sea. We grinned crookedly as we looked at the band, but suddenly we each felt that everything would be all right now. I passed a red-haired beauty from the women's auxiliary, exchanged smiles with her, and in her brown eyes I also read a hint of better times to come. We were loaded onto the train, and it rolled down the tracks. We all huddled around the windows. Pretty soon everyone was shouting, hooting and hollering, for an amazing thing had happened. Women were standing along the road. They were cheering, waving, dancing, sending air kisses, and generally expressing their excitement at seeing the 1st US Marine Division. The train stopped in Richmond, a suburb of the capital, and we were taken to a fenced-in area that looked like a cattle pen. On the other side of the fence were girls. They giggled, shouted jokes, waved handkerchiefs, and thrust their hands through the gaps to touch us. You can imagine our feelings. We hadn't seen the women since New Zealand, that is, for over 7 months. And then the gates opened. "Mer company, fall in, forward march." And off we went, grins on our faces, rifles hanging from our shoulders, past the laughing girls. From the outside there was nothing military about our column, and so the Lotus Eaters were born. We were a little surprised when it turned out that we had been led into a stadium. It was a Melbourne cricket ground. Here we were to be accommodated. There were rows of bunks on the cement steps. The benches had been removed and replaced by bunks, and now the whole structure looked like a giant horseshoe, with rows of spider-like threads running around a large green field. This was where we were to live. We were to sleep in the open air, protected by some sort of roof, so that we would not be afraid of rain. No one complained, and who would pay attention to such minor inconveniences on the first day of our return to civilization? There was no need to pick on the happy fate that had thrown us into a cricket ground in the heart of the city, while the other regiments, the 5th, 7th and 11th Artillery, remained in the suburbs. The city was at our disposal. We could taste it every night. We didn't earn it. We rather won it. Our regimental commander, in a toss with the commanders of the 5th and 7th regiments, tossed a lucky coin. Of all the regiments, the 1st was in the most advantageous position for a big debauchement. Discipline already riddled with the angelic voices of the local girls. That night was generally enjoyed. We received part of our 6 months' allowance in Australian pounds, but we were not issued clothing. We were still in Guadalcanal rags. Still, a third of the regiment poured out into the streets of Melbourne. I went for a walk alone. Runner, crestfallen, big boy and the rest were either dressed up or unwilling to risk it. What a delightful, intoxicating night it was. At first I thought I was arousing everyone's curiosity because of my strange clothes and my black and tan face. But I soon realized there was more to it than that. I was a deliverer in a land I had saved. I was convinced by the friendly smiles of the Melbournians. Even the street vendors had placards saying, "Thank you, Yanks, you saved Australia." It was flattery, but it worked like strong wine. I felt what a real triumph was, and very soon began to accept the smiles of Melbourne girls as a just reward for the tanned liberator. The first was Guion. We met in a milk bar. Agreed, a strange place for a Marine looking around with hungry eyes after a 7-month abstinence. But the thing is, all pubs in Melbourne close at 6 o'clock, and I didn't know then that hotels served drinks for a few hours longer. I noticed her the first moment I entered the premises. There was genuine interest in her eyes, but when I sat down next to her and sipped my milkshake, she acted indifferent. I didn't know what to say, so I asked her what time it was. She looked meaningfully at the watch on my arm, then shifted her gaze to the clock hanging over our heads, and "Are you a Yankee boy?" Her voice was melodic and very pleasant, and it didn't matter that she didn't invite me over. The important thing was that she spoke to me. Yes, I replied. We just arrived from Guadalcanal. Really? Her eyes rounded with surprise. It must have been terrible there. Polite words, formal words, words without meaning, but words animated by the voice of flesh, words leading to the same result. So after several stops at different bars, she finally uttered the cherished, "Let's go to my place," and everything that had been said before became meaningless. That's where we went. There was the flickering light of a gas horn and a bed. Nothing else. In an inscrutable manner, as only women can do, Ian briefly instructed her assertive guess. There would be no Kletch pounce in her young life, and no American bastard would insult her in her declining years. In other words, there would be nothing until she had a ring on her finger. Putting on the utmost seriousness possible in such circumstances, I rose from the ungrateful cot, regained my uniform and my dignity, and I quietly closed the door behind me and walked out into the still, warm night, thinking gloomily of the American movie that had convinced the whole world that all American men were millionaires without exception, and cursing the conceit of the female half of humanity. Why, pray tell, were they all so firmly convinced that no man had ever been born who couldn't be fooled? In downtown Melbourne, around Flinders Street train station, the streets were filled with Marines. I used to think that about a third of our regiment had gone to town, but now I realized it was at least half. Some still wore beards. This motley crowd looked only remotely like a horde that had come from the jungles of Guadalcanal. But now they were waving bottles, Australian meat pies, ice cream, whatever they could get at the 24-hour kiosks. Songs were heard on all sides. That night everyone learned at least 2 verses of Matilda dancing the waltz. One day a jolly boatman stopped at the mouth of the river, under the shade of a big tree. He waited for the water to boil and sang, "Will you dance a waltz with me, Matilde?" I had enough money left to hire a horse and carriage from the ones at the station. Half a dozen lads piled in, and I took the coachman's seat. And we rode back, munching on the good things we had bought in town, sipping from bottles and shouting songs, while the good-natured animal pulled the carriage along, tapping its hooves on the sidewalk. The next day we drank to the death of discipline. Everyone now had the appropriate number of bottles for the occasion. Everyone drank to the death of discipline, and the unfortunate woman did indeed give her soul to God, while we continued to drink with our feet on her cold corpse. The orgy dragged on indefinitely, and the awakening was terrible. As I recall, that wake-up call was a prolonged farce. "Wake up! Wake up!" shrieked a voice hoarse from a drunken bender. Silence. It was only after a while that a dozen or so of the 200 dead sleepers arose like dead men from their graves, wrapped tightly in a shroud of blankets. 1 or 2 of the zombies bent down to find a well-hidden bottle. Then they dragged themselves downstairs for formation and roll call. Old Gunny took a few steps forward and stared in amazement at the handful of reanimated mummies. Lieutenant Ivy prepared to take his report. Gunny was clearly confused. He called off, fingers clenched tight as if they were glue, and reported, "All present." Ivy gave him a look of grim solemnity, then glanced at us and ordered, "Make sure everybody's back from leave." And he went back to our graves. And then they let us go. Probably the officers, all of them, without exception, wanted to have fun too. We were paid, provided with new uniforms, including the green jackets we had worn 18 months before, and told where to get food and medicine, except to those assigned to the outfit. Everyone was free from noon. Even the sentries found something to do. Those who wished to walk with a Marine, and for that reason often called on the watch officer, were nicknamed grass monkeys because of their habit of lying for long periods in the tall grass of Victoria Park, which surrounded our stadium. Grass monkeys favoured the sentries at the sideline gate and those on foot patrol, so soon enough a joke went around. For the first time in the history of the US Marine Corps, there were volunteers for the role of sentries. But the grass monkeys made life a lot easier for those of us who were too late in town. If you were late, all you had to do was walk around the stadium until you saw a rifle leaning against the wall, evidence that the sentry was busy on the sidelines. Then you could open the gate and walk in boldly. Each day brought a new pleasure, another discovery. We tried Australian beer and were delighted to discover that it was in no way inferior to Japanese beer. We found bars teeming with different varieties of Scotch whisky. We learned that Sheila is a girl, Cobber is a friend, and what they call boyser is excellent. It also turned out that the word Yankee in the mouths of Australians can be both a compliment and a swear word. In the first week we stumbled into a little restaurant on Swan Street, and there was a sparkling hooch open. We asked for champagne, but the waitress said they didn't have any. But we have sparkling hock," she said in Australian Cockney, which is pretty much the same thing. "Does it bubble?" Hohotun asked, trying to express the same in sign language. "Do you understand?" Like ginger ale? It was unlikely that Hotutan would be able to explain to the Italian matron what spaghetti was. The waitress snorted condescendingly. "You Yankees." And then she stepped aside and returned immediately, carrying a bucket of ice and a bottle. The cork popped into the ceiling as if it were real champagne, the liquid sparkling and bubbling, and the taste was no different. We enjoyed it as much as we could afford, which was the main feature of this drink. Hohotun and I clapped loudly. "I sail with the war," he said. "I'm for peace," I proclaimed. We finished the bottle and countless others, munching on delicious Australian steaks and eggs. This place became our headquarters. This is where we brought the girls for dinner, and this is also where we met Hope and Molly. Hope had all the qualities necessary to make a fortune in Hollywood. A large oval face with thick brown hair framing it, huge eyes, large sensual mouth, straight nose, straight features. But the marvelously beautiful eyes were completely empty. There was no glimmer of intelligence in them. Her beautiful face expressed nothing. Hope was a classic bar girl whose main asset was her immaculate ass. She clung to Hogai with a dead grip and remained his girlfriend until we left Australia. Hope couldn't stand me, thought I was a stuck-up, arrogant prig. Molly was different. She would often take me away from Creeper and Hope, and then we would go to the park and take long walks, singing and joking with each other. She knew from the beginning where our friendship would end. She had no thoughts, like Hope, of an easy life in the States. Her interest in me and the other Marines was warm and human. She accepted us for who we were and didn't think about the future. Poor Molly. She loved a lot, perhaps too much. Tell me about America, she would sometimes ask as we strolled, hand in hand, through the shady avenues of the park, our feet sinking into the grass, the night air caressing our heated cheeks. At this time and place we were very fond of each other. And I was telling. We sat on a bench or lay on the lake shore, looking up into the amazing southern sky, studded with stardust. The smell of flowering trees added to the enchantment of the magical night. "You know, Lucky, I hope they don't send you back." "Neither do I." "But they'll send you back, won't they?" "Oh, don't think about it, Molly. There's nothing we can do about it anyway. War is war." "Yes, but if it hadn't been for war, we wouldn't have met. We should be grateful to her for that." She was never sad for long, and soon she'd start joking. "You Yankees are very good at flattery. All that sweet talk, good manners, but in fact you all want only one." We got up and went deeper into the park again. We walked along the paths, sometimes chasing each other, but more often singing. Molly could sing with my voice. God bless her. She was the only woman in my life who thought I could sing. Maybe she was just saying that to get me to sing American songs, which she was very fond of. But Molly herself really had a marvelous voice, fresh, clear, ringing. There was one song in particular I liked, and she often hummed it softly as we walked home. Every morning, with the sparrows waking up, insistent as an arrow, leaving the bow, he'll come into her garden and sing beneath her window. Sweet Molly O'Donoghue, it's you I'm asking to come for a walk with me. But Molly and I quarrelled over another girl and broke up, and Horton stayed by Hope's side. The break-up between Molly and I was over Sheila. I'd met her on the bus that Hohotun and I were taking to St Kilda, a resort in the suburbs of Melbourne, just like Coney Island, but not as dazzling and much less like a big pub. At the end of the route, the bus jerked sharply, and Sheila fell right into my lap. I pulled her tight against me and demanded, "Stand up, please." "I can't get up," she said, laughing. "Aren't you ashamed?" I whispered in her ear. "Australian girls are too straightforward and in too much of a hurry. 180. Please?" she asked, giggling and trying to turn around to get a good look at me. "Let me stand up." What is she talking about? I looked at crestfallen, perplexed. Am I supposed to let her go? Let her go? I'm not keeping her, am I? She likes it here, he nodded. Sheila gave Hohotun an indignant look and raised her voice slightly. "Let me go right now." "Okay." I agreed easily, "but only if you come with me to Luna Park." "Okay," she said, thinking for a second. "It's a deal." I let go of the girl, and she immediately got to her feet. Then she introduced us to a friend she was travelling with, and the four of us went to Luna Park. Then we all rode the train together to one of the outlying suburbs, where Hohotun and I stayed the night at Sheila's mother's house. Hohotun was assigned a room in the house and I was assigned a detached cottage. I think it could have been used as a stall too. Sheila called it a paddock. It was about 15 feet from the house. The mattress was soft, the sheets cool and clean-smelling. I fell asleep instantly. I woke up from a strange noise. When I looked up, I saw Sheila closing the door. She was wearing a nightgown and holding a candle in her hand. "Hello, Yankee," she said playfully. "How do you like it here?" I propped myself up on my elbow and nodded. I didn't feel like talking. She knelt down beside the bed and looked up into my face, her eyes laughing. "I like you, Yankee. I hope you will come to see me often." In answer to my questioning look, she drew nearer and whispered, "What do you want me to do?" I held out my hands to her, and she blew out the candle. I tried to go out with Sheila whenever the opportunity arose. It went on for about a month. We'd have dinner at our headquarters, go dancing, or go for long walks in the pretty town where she lived, where the Australian mimosa bloomed lushly on the hillsides. Sometimes we would just sit in the living room of her house, drinking endless cups of tea to wet our throats, parched from the stories about America that her crippled and early widowed mother loved so much. It was only at the very end, when Sheila announced that she was returning to Tasmania, that it was revealed that my beloved was married. After Molly and Sheila, I tried not to get attached to anyone else. All that was left was casual, non-committal liaisons. How was I supposed to behave? I don't know. I am not Casanova, and this book is not a textbook on amorous adventures. There was no more warmth, only cold calculation, but it was hardly worth the risk of hurting my feelings again when it came to satisfying a physical need. You can't be romantic. It won't lead to anything good. Let romantic love be left to the poets who invented it. Sometimes flirting ended in a very strange way. I recall a waitress who had extremely strict notions of morality. 183. "You Yankees," she often said, "have no idea of morality." "I'm trying." "One need only look," she explained wryly, "at your Hollywood. You read every day about movie stars who live with whomever they won. Tomorrow another. Married 5 or even more times. You'd have a hard time with that in Australia. We still had morals." She pressed her lips together and checked that all the buttons on her chest were fastened. "Not like you Yanks. All you want from a girl is to sleep with her." No one argued with her. That night on my way home, I met another Marine, much younger than me. He was busy diligently wiping lipstick off the collar of his shirt. "Trouble with these Australian girls," he complained. "Sometimes I think they don't think about morality. They're too easily available. Try to find an American girl who behaves the same way. You can't. Ours still have morals. The followers of Pharisee are innumerable legion in number. Oh my God, I thank you that I am not like other men, adulterous. Whether Australian, whether American, whether..." That waitress serving drinks remained a mystery to me. Whenever I found myself in her company, I could not understand her. She had an obvious contempt for Americans, and if she didn't see me, she would take it out on another Marine. She liked to receive money, but if she thought I had insulted her, took it out of her pocket and defiantly returned it to me. Temperamental, she was as cold as a fish. A waitress serving drinks. She never drank herself. Scoffing at American music, she could walk a kilometre to listen to jazz and dance. When we went for a boat ride on the Yarra, she dipped her hand into the water and watched intently as the water washed over her slender fingers, while trying so hard to show that she was desperately bored that I secretly cheered. The thing is, we Marines have gotten spoiled and pampered, and paddling upstream has become a real challenge. So, as soon as she started yawning, I turned back and paddled briskly to the dock. As soon as she stepped ashore, she turned red with anger and started cursing. There are guys like you. It is simply incomprehensible to invite a girl for a walk on the river and bring her back without once looking at her with tenderness. The next day my back and arms ached, and I was not anxious to see her again, much less take her for a ride. Sheila came back. Saturday night I had to stay at the stadium. There was nothing to do, and I went to bed very early, but I was soon woken up and told that there was a girl outside the gate asking for me. She had only spent a few months in Tasmania, but seemed to be much older. We went to the park and couldn't talk for a long time. Sheila wanted to go into town, but I explained that I couldn't, and even the fact that she would have to go back to Tasmania in the morning couldn't change anything. "Well, then we can just sit in the park," she said. Wait, I exclaimed. I have an idea. All of ours are gone for 48 hours. I'll bring their sleeping bags and blankets over here right now and you go get a beer. With those words, I handed her the money. We'll have a picnic. Yankee, you're a sweetheart. She laughed. The bunks were empty and the pace was slow. I gathered the blankets from the bunks of Creepy, Big Boy, and mine, rolled them into a weighty roll, and headed for the park. Sheila came there with a beer. I spread out the blankets under a towering tree. We sat down, and I reached for the bottle. A groan of disappointment followed. She'd forgotten the bottle opener. Don't worry, Yankee. She laughed again. We'll find a way out. With that, she took the bottle of Melbourne bitter to her mouth and bit off the cork with her teeth. Saucy girls, I thought, as the delicious amber liquid spilled out onto the tree. You know, that's a serious offence, she said, making herself comfortable beside me. It's an insult to the royal domain. What's that? All public property belongs to the Crown. Something like this is called trespassing, and you can even go to jail for it. That's great. I was happy. So you and I are poachers now. That would be a show. And I agree to go to jail only with you and me in the same cell. We spent the night in the park, and in the morning, when the grey dawn pulled back the black veil of night, she left. Now forever. I gathered up the bedding and dragged it back to the stadium. To my horror, the formation had already begun. Holding a huge bale of blankets, I was as inconspicuous as an elephant, a clear and obvious desecrator of royal territory. But I decided that I had nothing to lose, so I just had to hold on as if nothing had happened. Burying my face in the bale, I started to trot. I shall never forget the bewildered look of surprise on old Gappy's face as I trotted between him and Company H. I got within 10 paces of him. I had gone about 10 paces when there was a giggle, then a whistle, followed by a general laughter. I increased my speed. But the laughter was spreading faster than I could run. Now I was running as fast as I could, driven by the whirlwind of laughter and shouting. It was he who brought me through the gate and pushed me up the steps. If I had offended the king that night, my companions had more than repaid me on his behalf. Many things can limit a man in great debauchement. Malaria and guard duty. Malaria means hospitalization, sometimes even being sent home. We were so eager to take everything from life that a man in discomfort over an impending attack would stubbornly go to town anyway. It was not uncommon to find such a poor man standing by a lamppost with a face as white as chalk and clenching teeth, desperately trying to wrap his shivering body in a thin shirt. He clung to the last vestiges of his slipping consciousness, trying not to fall and to look for a cab that would take him back to the camp, where he could collapse with relief on a bed in the infirmary. Swordman's bouts of malaria were getting worse and more frequent. The last time I saw him, he was lying on a bunk in the infirmary they had built under the stadium. He had a severe form of malaria in which the body goes up in flames and the bones are stretched out on the rack. I came to say goodbye to him. There was a rumour that he was being sent home. I was not sure if he recognized me, and I did not ask him any questions, for such terrible suffering does not permit the intervention of another human being. So I silently bade farewell to Swordsman, a lad I genuinely loved, possessed of a sarcastic mind and strong nerves. I held his scalding hot hand for a few moments and murmured the words of farewell quietly. For a moment I thought he did recognize me. His lips curled in a way that, with some imagination, could have been mistaken for an attempt at a smile. But I couldn't see him suffer, so I let go of his hand and walked away quickly. Those who were not subject to malaria could only be kept from being boiled in the common cauldron by guard duty. When our battalion went on guard duty, it didn't matter which company, we all stayed in readiness in the stadium. It was reminiscent of the old days in New River, as if time had described a circle and returned to the old barracks and the old problems. Beer and fuel. We'd come back from boot camp and wash up. After getting rid of our underwear, we would give our heated bodies to the pleasant coolness of the shower. Then someone would grab buckets. This time it was beer, not fuel. And the squad would gather in the fresh air. Everyone was there. Chuckles, Runner, Big Boy, Stump, Hamish, Gent. Now we had some newcomers with us. Wide Smile, a very good-looking kid from Louisiana, who had arrived on Guadalcanal much later than we did, and Big Ski, a tall, long-legged, sickly, pale infantryman, who had also arrived on Guadalcanal at the very end of the war and liked to talk, with a contemptuous curve of his lip, about his military adventures in Hawaii and his wife back home. Big Ski was the only married man among us. So we spent our night sitting in the cool air in the thickening darkness around the giant horseshoe surrounding the cricket field. We sang, listened to endless stories, or just dreamed. The songs we sang were not our own. America had not yet given us a song we could consider our own. So we borrowed whatever we liked from everyone we could. From the Australians we took Matilda dancing the waltz and Bless Them All. From the English, who we had never seen, we took I've Got Six Paces. But such a life soon came to an end. The day we moved to the camp at Deptinong was the end of a comparatively easy life. It's all battle dressing again. Helmets clanking against rifle barrels, narrow straps cutting into shoulders, into flesh barely grown on bones. The shrieking sergeants not hiding their pleasure at what was happening. It all happened again, as if an old, disgusting acquaintance had dropped in for a drink, believing his appearance in this town to be a good thing, but only resurrecting a former feud. We were in full readiness and just waiting for the order to march. Form up. Meditate. A moment of silence, a brief moment of emptiness devoid of sound and motion, separating one infinitesimal quantity from another, perhaps infinity itself, and then painfully familiar, unmistakable sea. A simultaneous gusty sigh of a large number of people preparing to march, followed by the stomping of many feet on the sidewalk. We hit the road. Mom said there would be days like this, but she didn't say there would be so many. Hey, get your gun out of my face. You want to cause an accident? You stay out of my arse or you'll never get a Purple Heart. What the hell's a Purple Heart? He won't even get a purple arse. On the march, we were accompanied by dogs. They ran along the column and barked happily, quite peacefully. They were so obviously silly, friendly, and ready to love everyone that we laughed heartily at these funny creatures. The kind of sentimental laughter that makes the corners of your eyes moisten. Look at those fools, exclaimed Hotatune. We walk 100 meters, and they run 2 kilometers during this time. They'll run out of steam about halfway. He was right, although he greatly diminished the capabilities of our four-legged companions. We had covered 6 kilometers when I saw the first Barbos, stretched out on the side of the road without strength. He had his head between his front paws and his tongue out in the roadside dust. It was already half-greyed. The dog watched sadly as we passed by. Poor thing, he's a goner, and more animals were left on the roadside, but they were stubbornly unwilling to leave us. None of them deserted. I stopped feeling sorry for the dogs when I felt my feet starting to blister. Some of us had been issued New Zealand Army boots before the trek, and I was one of the unfortunate ones who received them. They were made of thick and surprisingly hard black leather with unbendable soles and snapping heels. They were totally unsuitable for us, for we were already used to the Marines' shoes made of normal leather with soft rubber soles, specially made so as not to make noise. Not like these torture instruments from New Zealand. Imagine a boot made entirely of steel. It worked on my feet with the subtle brutality of a professional executioner. For the next 15 kilometers, pain became my constant companion, and every step seemed to be my last. I knew that a normal person could not endure such hellish agony for long, but I stubbornly went on, and I reached our new camp. When I showed my blistered feet to the battalion doctor, he shook his head and said that I should have walked the last 10 kilometers on my hands. I agreed and felt something akin to sensual pleasure as he opened the blisters, let the fluid drain out, bandaged my feet, and let me limp back to my friends. I was not the only one injured. As a result, we were no longer issued such boots. The ones we had already received were enough to incapacitate a quarter of the battalion.